It's almost always the same hour, somewhere around 3 in the morning, when the house is silent and there's nothing left to distract me. One memory finds its way back. Not a tragedy, not a disaster. Just a moment, small, ordinary on the surface, where I chose wrong and never got the chance to choose again. If there's a memory like that for you, one moment out of an entire long life that still finds you in the dark, I want you to know you're not alone in that, and you're not broken for carrying it. Tonight I want to tell you about mine, not to wallow in it, but because I've finally learned something about what to do with a regret that can't be undone. And I think, if you stay with me, you might find something here for your own. His name doesn't matter for this story. I'll just call him my friend, because that's what he was, for nearly 40 years before he was anything else to me. We met when we were both 23, working the same job at a company that no longer exists. We became close the way men sometimes do, not through long conversations about our feelings, but through proximity, through showing up, through the 1,000 small shared moments that accumulate into something neither of us would have called friendship out loud, but that was, unmistakably, exactly that. He stood beside me at my wedding. I stood beside him at his. We raised our children a few streets apart from each other for a stretch of years that I now understand, looking back, were some of the best of my life. And then, the way it happens to almost everyone eventually, life pulled us in different directions. Not dramatically, just gradually. A job change, a move across town, then across the state. The slow erosion that happens to even strong friendships when nothing forces you to stay close and nothing reminds you, in the moment, how rare what you have actually is. The last time I saw him alive, he was in a hospital bed, and we both knew, though neither of us said it plainly, that this would likely be the last conversation we ever had. He had been sick for the better part of a year. I had visited a handful of times during that stretch, called more often than I visited, told myself that distance and my own health limitations were good enough reasons for the gaps between those visits. That particular afternoon I sat beside his bed for almost 2 hours. We talked about old times. We laughed about a story involving a borrowed car and a parking ticket that neither of us had ever fully resolved, even 40 years later. It was in many ways a good visit. The kind you'd want if you had to choose how to spend some of your last hours with someone you loved. But there was something I didn't say, something I had been carrying for almost 15 years related to a falling out we'd had in our 50s, a disagreement about money, about a business venture that had gone wrong, about words exchanged in anger that we had never properly addressed, even though we had, on the surface, moved past it and resumed our friendship as if nothing had happened. We never talked about it directly again after that argument. We simply continued the friendship as if the wound had healed itself, the way men of my generation often do, through time and proximity rather than through actual conversation. I had decided, sitting in that hospital room, that I was finally going to say it. I was going to tell him that I was sorry for my part in that old argument, that I had carried guilt about some of the things I'd said for over a decade, that our friendship had meant more to me than that single bad stretch of years, and I wanted him to know that clearly in words before it was too late to say them. I had rehearsed it in a way on the drive to the hospital. I knew roughly what I wanted to say, and then I sat there, in that quiet room with the machines making their small sounds, and the moment came and I didn't say it. I told myself it wasn't the right time, that he was tired, that bringing up something difficult might upset him when what he needed was comfort, not confession, that there would be another visit, another conversation, another chance to say what I actually meant. I told myself a great many reasonable-sounding things. What I actually felt, underneath all of that reasoning, was simply fear. Fear of how it would feel to say those words out loud. Fear that he might respond in a way I wasn't prepared for. Fear, plainly, of vulnerability. The specific kind of vulnerability that comes from admitting you were wrong to someone who has the power to forgive you or not. So I said goodbye instead. I told him I loved him. We had by then become old enough and soft enough to say that plainly to each other, which is its own kind of progress for men of our era. I told him I'd see him soon. He passed away 9 days later. There was no other visit, no other chance. I want to tell you what that regret has actually been like to live with, because I think the texture of it matters more than the simple fact of it. It is not a constant ache. Most days I don't think about it at all. I have a full life, children, grandchildren, friends, ordinary tasks that fill ordinary hours. The regret does not dominate my waking life, but at night, particularly in that strange quiet hour between 2 and 4 in the morning, when sleep has thinned out and the mind has nothing else to occupy it, that hospital room comes back to me with a clarity that almost frightens me. I can recall with complete precision the exact temperature of the room, the specific quality of the light through the blinds, the sound the machine beside his bed made every few seconds, the exact words I had rehearsed and did not say. And in that hour the regret does not feel like something from 40 years ago that happened once and is finished. It feels current, immediate, as though the chance is still somehow available, just out of reach, and if I could only find the right door, I could walk back into that room and say what I meant to say. Of course, there is no such door. That's what makes this particular kind of regret different from almost anything else in my life. Most mistakes you can learn from and apply that learning going forward. This one has no forward application. The person it concerns is gone. The conversation that needed to happen will never happen. I want to be careful here because I think there's a difference between guilt and regret, and understanding that difference has mattered enormously to me. Guilt, as I've come to understand it, is the feeling that you did something wrong and deserve to suffer for it. Guilt has a kind of self-punishing quality. It says, you are bad and this feeling is the appropriate cost of being bad. Regret is different. Regret is grief directed at a choice rather than a loss. It says something mattered and I handled it in a way I wish I hadn't, and I cannot go back and handle it differently. For a long time I carried this particular memory as guilt. I told myself I was a coward in that hospital room, that I had failed my friend in his final days by prioritizing my own comfort over honesty, that this failure said something damning about my character as a whole, that framing made the regret heavier than it needed to be. It turned a single moment of human fear into a verdict on my entire worth as a friend, as a man, as a person who had spent decades loving the people in my life imperfectly but genuinely. It took me years to separate the two, to say to myself, I made a choice, in a moment of real fear, that I would make differently if I could. That does not make me a bad person. It makes me a person who, like every person who has ever lived, sometimes chooses fear over courage when it matters most. I told my son about this, a few years after my friend passed. We were sitting on my porch on an ordinary evening, and something about the quality of the conversation that night opened a door I hadn't planned to open. I told him the whole story. The argument decades earlier, the hospital visit, the words I had rehearsed and never said. He listened without interrupting, the way people listen when they sense something real is being handed to them. When I finished, he didn't try to fix it. He didn't tell me it wasn't my fault, or that I shouldn't feel bad, or any of the comforting things people sometimes say that, however well-intentioned, can feel like they're trying to talk you out of a feeling you've earned the right to have. He just said, "That sounds like it's been heavy to carry alone." That was it. No advice, no solution, but something about having said it out loud, finally, to another person, after carrying it silently for years, changed its weight slightly, not removed it. Regret like this doesn't get removed, but it became something I had shared rather than something I was hiding, and those are different kinds of heavy. I have gone to my friend's grave many times since then. I want to tell you about something I started doing there because it surprised me with how much it helped. I started saying the thing, out loud, standing at that headstone, with no one else around to hear it. I said what I had rehearsed in the car all those years ago and failed to say in that hospital room. I told him I was sorry. I told him our friendship had mattered more to me than that one difficult stretch of years. I told him I loved him and that I regretted, more than almost anything else in my life, not saying these specific words while he could still hear them. I want to be honest about what this did and didn't do. It did not erase the original failure. He never heard those words while he was alive, and no amount of speaking to a stone changes that basic fact. I am not going to pretend otherwise, because I think pretending would be a kind of dishonesty that doesn't serve anyone, especially not you if you're carrying something similar. But it did something else. It gave the words somewhere to go. For years they had simply circled inside me with nowhere to land. Speaking them, even to a grave, even decades too late, gave them a destination, and a feeling that had nowhere to go is, in my experience, far heavier than a feeling that has been released somewhere, even imperfectly. I also did something else, more recently, that I think matters for anyone listening who is carrying a similar weight. I wrote a letter. Not to send anywhere, because there was no one left to send it to in the way the original conversation would have required. But a letter, addressed to my friend, where I wrote out the entire thing, the argument, the years of silence about it, the hospital room, the regret, all of it, in full, without editing myself, without softening it to make myself look better. I kept that letter in a drawer for a while. Then, on what would have been his birthday, I burned it, not as a ritual with any particular meaning beyond what I gave it personally. I want to be clear, this isn't a religious or spiritual practice I'm prescribing, just something I did, privately, that felt right to me. Watching it burn, I had the strange and unexpected sense of finally finishing something that had been left open for decades. Not resolved exactly. Some things don't resolve, but finished, in the sense that I had said everything I needed to say, even if I had said it 40 years too late and to no one who could respond. I want to tell you why I'm sharing all of this, because it isn't simply to unburden myself, though I won't pretend there isn't some of that happening too. I'm sharing it because I think there's something important in here for anyone who has an unsaid thing sitting somewhere in their chest. A friend they haven't spoken to in years over something that probably doesn't matter as much as the silence has made it matter. A parent or sibling they're estranged from, where pride has stood in for actual reasons for longer than anyone can quite explain. A conversation they keep meaning to have and keep finding reasons to delay. What I learned, the hardest possible way, is that you very rarely get the dramatic, clear signal that says, "This is your last chance, say it now." Most of the time you get an ordinary afternoon, a hospital room that doesn't feel different enough from all the other ordinary moments in your life to alert you that this one matters more than you think it does. If there is one thing I would want someone watching this to take from my particular regret, it's this. The conversation you keep deciding isn't the right time for might not get a better time. It might simply be this time, ordinary as it feels, or no time at all. I want to tell you about something I did, directly because of everything I've described. I had a cousin I had been estranged from for almost 20 years, over something so old and so small that by the time I thought about calling him, I could barely remember the original cause with any precision. Just an accumulated weight of pride on both sides, neither of us willing to be the one to reach out first. After everything with my friend, I picked up the phone one evening and called him. I didn't have a speech prepared this time. I simply said his name when he answered, and then I said, "It's been too long and I don't entirely know why, and I'd like that to change, if you're willing." There was a long pause on his end, long enough that I wondered if I'd made a mistake. Then he said, "Yeah, I'd like that too." We talked for almost an hour. We have talked several times since. It is not the same as the friendship we had as young men. Too many years have passed for that, and I don't think either of us is trying to fully recreate what's gone. But it is something. A door that had been closed for 2 decades, open again however carefully. I don't know how much time either of us has left, but I know I will not carry a second version of that hospital room regret with him. Whatever happens from here, I said the thing while there was still time to say it. I still have the 3 in the morning hour. I want to be honest about that because I don't want to suggest that everything I've described here resolved the original regret into something painless. Some nights, that hospital room still finds me. The light through the blinds, the sound of the machine, the words I rehearsed and didn't say, but the hour is different now than it used to be. It used to arrive as pure ambush, a sudden sharp reminder of a failure I had no way to address, sitting there in the dark with nowhere to put it. Now it arrives more like a visitor I recognize, painful still but familiar, a grief I have made some kind of peace with carrying, rather than a wound I am still actively bleeding from. I think that distinction matters more than people realize. Not every regret can be resolved. Some debts simply cannot be paid to the person they're owed to, because that person is no longer here to receive payment. But a regret you have spoken aloud, written down, learned from, and acted on in other relationships, even if you cannot undo the original moment, becomes a different kind of weight than a regret you have kept entirely silent and entirely alone. If you are carrying something like this, a moment you wish you could go back into, a conversation that closed before you said the thing that mattered, I want to say a few things to you plainly because I wish someone had said them to me decades ago. You are not uniquely cowardly for having failed to say the hard thing in the moment that mattered most. Nearly everyone who has lived long enough has at least one moment like this. The specific content differs, but the shape of it, fear winning out over courage, just once, in a moment that turned out to matter more than it seemed to at the time. That shape is almost universal among people who have lived seriously enough to have something to regret. You are allowed to grieve the words you didn't say without that grief becoming a permanent verdict on your character. And if there is anyone still living who you have an unsaid thing with, even something that feels too old, too small, too awkward to bring up after all this time, I would gently encourage you to consider reaching toward them, not because it's guaranteed to go well, it might not. But because the alternative, as I learned in that hospital room, is sometimes a silence that has no second chance. I am 82 years old. I still think about my friend often, not only the regret, but the 40 years of friendship that came before it, which I think I owe more attention to than I've given it in this story. The borrowed car, the wedding toasts, the decades of ordinary days that mattered more than either of us understood while we were living them. The regret is real. I am not going to pretend it has disappeared, because pretending wouldn't serve you and it wouldn't be honest about my own life, but it sits now alongside something else. A kind of hard-earned peace that comes not from undoing the original failure, but from doing something useful with what it taught me. A cousin I called after 20 years of silence, a son who knows the whole story, unedited. A letter, written and burned, that finally gave the words somewhere to go. That is not the same as fixing it. Some things cannot be fixed, but it is, I have come to believe, the most honest kind of peace available to a person carrying a regret that cannot be undone. And I will take that, gladly. At 82, I have learned not to ask for more than what is actually available. If something in this found you tonight, if you have a 3 a.m. hour of your own, with a memory that visits you the same way mine visits me, I would like to know about it. Leave a comment. Tell me what you wish you had said, and to whom. Tell me if there's still time to say it, and what you might do with that time. This is exactly the kind of conversation I started this channel to have. Not the easy version, the real one. If this reached you, please subscribe. We're here every week talking honestly about the years that deserve more honesty than they usually get. Thank you for staying with me through this one. I know it wasn't an easy hour to spend. I don't take that lightly.